You're tuned to WPPM LP Philadelphia 106.5 FM, PhillyCam Community Radio, and PhillyCam TV, also streaming live to Facebook. Thank you for tuning in to Reimagine, a partnership between Reclaim Philadelphia, Resolve Philly, and PhillyCam.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Reimagine, a monthly hour-long show hosted by Reclaim Philadelphia and Resolve Philly, bringing together community resources and leaders to discuss how policy impacts lived experiences of working class, Black and Brown communities, and we hope to imagine better futures together and offer real steps in social transformation. Forgot to introduce myself, but hi, my name is Demo. I use she, they pronouns, and I am the communications organizer over at Reclaim.
Each month, we'll take questions from our Equal Info text line and share answers and comments with viewers. As organizers throughout the city, we'll connect each issue with political analysis and concrete steps for staying engaged and involved in making changes on the personal, neighborhood, and citywide level. This month on our show, we're talking about Philly city budget. Each show will begin with a story because we believe stories are powerful and help us connect with each other's lived experiences. We want to ground our TV show in each other's lived experiences and how invisible and visible forces of structural racism are being felt in the lives of our Black and Brown communities. When we come back, Demo, who you just met, will introduce us to Katya Perez, who will kick us off sharing their experience testifying to City Council on the budget.
Hello, Kara.
Hi there.
Nice to meet you. Meet you on virtual scale, but joining me is a community member, Katya Perez, to talk about her experience testifying to City Council on the Philly budget proposal. Thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we dive right into the whole testifying experience with the Philly budget proposal, could you tell me a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, I grew up in a very privileged white suburb of Philadelphia, had a fantastically safe and well-resourced life. Like, I had food, I had private school, I went to the doctor when I needed it, I had writing lessons, guitar lessons, vacations, sort of everything I needed. So all I had to deal with was just like the regular human issues that everybody has to deal with, but nothing from the outside that impacted me in a traumatic way. So I was very lucky.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And for context, was this your first time testifying to City Council?
It was. I was really happy when I had the chance to do it. I hadn't thought about it before. I was in this privileged bubble right up into my 60s. And it wasn't until like 5 years ago that I began really studying structural inequality and learning from Black and Brown activists. And I just felt really grateful that I could have a chance to connect my privilege with what we're asking for, what I want to see happen with City Council and the budget, the budget allocation.
Yeah.
I'm just really glad to be able to put my experience behind that, because so many people who grew up like me in my network just don't realize that all of the great things we had came from basically budget allocations, but they were all for privileged people. Right. I mean, just going back decades and generations, I've been benefiting from government handouts that have helped create and shape a good life for me.
Yeah, no, definitely. And you can see the ways in which the pattern really connects, for sure. And so kind of going into that, what were your demands within your testimony?
Well, just asking that so many more resources be taken out of funding the police and given to all of the community programs that people in those badly impacted communities have been asking for. Just basic resources, food, stable housing, safety, not having the trauma of poverty and violence. So just asking for taxing people like me who've been well off. I'm happy to have my income and my resources taxed to make the city a more equitable place for people who have just not received the benefits that I have.
Yeah, definitely. And you kind of touched upon this a little bit before in terms of like what inspired you and, going back to the depth in research, when talking about structural racism or when talking about the ways in which Black and Brown communities and also poor and like working class communities can often be disenfranchised, right? And aside from that, what else inspired you to tell?
Just reading interesting people like Ta-Nehisi Coates and beginning to realize that it's hard to say what creates a moment when you begin to realize that there's a connection with all of the wider human community. I don't know exactly what catalyzed that, but to begin to look at things like the way my dad got a master's on the GI Bill, and that was not available to so many Black and Brown veterans because colleges weren't open to Black and Brown people. My parents got a loan to build their first house. Somebody helped subsidize land for them to build that. So to connect really viscerally with all the privileges that I've had and realize, I don't know what started that exactly. It was a confluence of things, but it's been my passion for maybe 4.5 years to keep learning from activists who really know to just listen, learn, be quiet, take direction, be humbled.
Yeah. No,
and I really hope City Council will listen. I hope more people in the position I'm in will speak up.
Yeah. Yeah. And going into that, why do you think it is important for you and others to continue to submit testimonies and continue to, really advocate rather for like this budget?
Well, I think that one of the big problems in talking about police funding or reallocating resources is that we don't have any kind of a vision in public imagination of what poor inner city neighborhoods could be like if they were well resourced like white suburbs are, or anywhere where there's been a history of resources. So it's really hard. It's a very triggered conversation with a lot of privileged people to talk about defunding police because there isn't a good picture of what community reinvestment really looks like. We have to start putting money there to begin to see what happens about violence, crime, housing security. When people have the basics that they need, it's transformative. But when the public doesn't have that in their imagination, it's really hard to put our money where our mouths are when so many people can't even picture what currently poor city neighborhoods would look like if more people just had the basics that they need.
Yeah. And I think that's a really not only like great like closing remark as well, but just really honing in on the fact that sometimes and most of the time, or if not all the time, there is a policing on our imagination, right? And trying to have that transformative, aspect when it comes to, justice in our communities, reimagining what community safety looks like, and all the things that we have been, really trying to talk about and amplify, like on our platforms, right? And in part of doing this specific episode, it's really important, and it goes back to generations, right? And this is how we're trying to stop that generational trauma.
Yeah. Sure. And it requires an acknowledgement that there is something we can't see. Activists who are working hard, but the rest of us can't see it. And it requires humility and just reimagining, like so many activist groups are saying.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And showing us how everyday community members can be a part of this process. We'll be right back with Resolve, who will jump into your questions on the Philly budget from the Equally Informed line.
But anyways, hi, everyone. In case you missed our first episode and want to know a little bit more about Equally Informed Philly, here's a little recap. Equally Informed Philly started in March 2020 in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're working to bridge information gaps in Philly by reducing barriers to getting important and trustworthy news and information. One way to do this is through our Equal Info line. It's a free Q&A text line available in both English and in Spanish, and we answer questions like, where can I vote? Or how can I apply for rental assistance? You can text Equal Info to 73224 to join, and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Equal Info 215.
Thank you, Kristine. I'm Lily. I use she, her pronouns. And for this week's episode of Reimagine, we're talking all things Philly budget and community safety.
And I'm Gabriela. The annual Philly budget determines how much money goes into every department that provides city services like trash collection, social services programs, police, and more. There's a lot of questions that surround the budget process, so let's go ahead and dive into them.
So who decides what goes into the budget?
So the new budget goes into effect every year in Philly on July 1st. That's the first day of our fiscal year. So the mayor typically presents a budget proposal to city council, and the council then holds a series of hearings for every department. So this is where officials can testify and answer questions about their department's budget.
The budget impacts the lives of all Philadelphians, so how can Philly residents get involved?
As Kara shared their experience earlier in the show, folks can get involved in a real way. So Philadelphians can make public testimonies during these public testimony sessions and bring community voices and needs to the council's attention and really lift up what the community actually wants to see funded. Philly residents can also contact council members' offices via phone or email.
It's really important that communities get involved. When is the budget finalized, Lily?
So it's not too late to make calls for council members, and actually there's a call-in day-to-day that Reclaim is organizing. And you can call in and express your wants and demands to the city. So city council can then make changes to the proposal, which must be approved before the end of June. Then the mayor signs the budget legislation into law.
How much money is in the proposed budget?
This year, Mayor Jim Kenney's proposed budget is $5.18 billion.
And Lily, where does the money come from? Trees?
Nah. Cities get most of their money from taxes. So Philly's wage tax is its biggest revenue source. In 2019, the Philly Inquirer reported that Philadelphia had the highest local wage tax in the country.
Does the city raise money in other ways?
Yep, so the city raises money from other taxes. That includes levies on properties, business income, real estate transfers, retail sales. The mayor and city council can change the tax rates each year when approving the budget, but money also comes from other agencies like the state and federal government.
And has Philly gotten any stimulus money from the federal government?
Yep. So the latest coronavirus stimulus plan provided $1.4 billion for Philadelphia. So this aid will play a significant role in the coming budget cycle. Of that money, half becomes available this calendar year, half will be provided next year.
So what is this money being spent on?
A whole lot of things. Everything from personnel costs for workers, contractors hired by the city, like the law firms that represent the city in courts, to officers and guards at City Hall. It also used to pay off the city's debt.
And what about the city departments?
Money is allocated for different city departments and programs in a big way. Here's the 4 biggest spending areas. That's police, fire, prisons, and criminal justice offices. So the Philadelphia Police Department historically has received the biggest chunk of the budget, and this year is no different. This budget season, the proposed police budget is $727 million. Fire department has a proposed budget of $361 million. Prisons proposed to receive $231 million. And then these other criminal justice offices, those include the courts, district attorney's office, public defenders, and lumped together are set to receive $234 million in the budget that Mayor Jim Kenney has proposed. So despite the amount of money being invested in these areas of city-led public safety efforts, a new survey found that Philadelphians do not feel they are being kept safe by the police.
So let's talk about what our communities need to be safe and what creating safe communities look like. The Investing in Safety We Can Feel campaign is doing the work to amplify answers to questions by hearing directly from Philly residents and communities. The groups behind Investing in Safety We Can Feel include Viet Lead, Amistad Law Project, Juntos, Philadelphia Community Bail Fund, Movement Alliance Project, PA's Working Families Party, and our friends at Reclaim Philadelphia.
So in the fall and winter of 2020, these community organizations put out a citywide survey asking questions about community safety. The survey includes questions like, how helpful are police when called? How good are the police at preventing violence? Which services do you feel the city has historically prioritized the least? Which approaches need more investment to make communities safer and healthier? And should police funds be reallocated to invest in communities?
When respondents were asked which survey has the city prioritized the least, survey respondents chose the following as those least prioritized by the city. So 78% of folks said that affordable housing was the least prioritized service, 77% said mental health services, and another 70% said the public schools and community colleges here in Philadelphia.
The report notes that the police budget has increased almost by $100 million over the past decade and now houses almost 7,500 employees. By contrast, the Office of Violence Prevention, tasked with keeping harm from happening in the first place, had only 13 employees for fiscal year 2021. On the topic of reallocating funds, Liz Hirsch of the Office of Supportive Housing stated, with an additional $31 million a year, we could end chronic street homelessness. That $31 million a year is a mere 4% of the police budget. 96% of survey respondents described the decision to reallocate police funds to the services previously mentioned as good or a very good decision.
In contrast to the police department's proposed budget of $727 million, the Department of Human Services is $176 million. The Departments of Public Health and Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disabilities is $186 million. Streets and Sanitation is $173 million, and Parks and Rec is $62 million.
I mean, the themes and trends in this report don't exist in a vacuum in the city. For today's episode of Reimagine, we wanted to hear from our Equal Info Line subscribers about what they have to say about city budget priorities. As a reminder, you can text Equal Info to 73224 to join our text line. You can ask us questions about life and work in Philly and receive news updates during the week to your phone. For today's episode, we texted out, what areas would you like to see the city spend money on? And here's what some residents around the city had to say.
A texter in South Philly said the city needs to spend money on a citywide publicly owned broadband network as a public utility.
Another texter in Fairhill said, make the streets safe for its citizens. It's tombstone territory out there.
A texter from Mantua said education and more funds going into support for family and community engagement.
One person from Strawberry Mansion said community-based services and amenities in response to stated needs, infrastructure, aka streets and sidewalks repaired, and improved trash collection and street sweeping, which could also result in jobs. Also, more after and out of school time activities for youth.
One person in West Philly said, more street trees and green spaces, please. Hire teenagers as street sweepers. Provide brooms, shovels, and bicycles to trailers for trash and recycling to clean our neighborhoods and to help teens build job skills and buying power.
A texter in Olney said that the city needs to spend more money on mental health services, education, and assistance for our unhoused population.
Okay, last one. This texter said, not cops, infrastructure, social services, not cops.
Lots and lots of overlap here in terms of themes and responses, and even more with our upcoming interview.
Yep. So this week, Kristine spoke with Adriaan Tompkins. He's a life skills teacher at a Philly charter school. Adriaan shares about his experience teaching in Philadelphia and how the issues of school safety impact his and his students' lives.
Hey, Adriaan, thank you so much for joining us here on our show and talking to us a little bit about your experience as a teacher at a charter school, particularly with gun violence. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Absolutely. So it has been quite an experience, especially I think as we have been speaking about a bit since COVID. I have had 10 kids who have either been affected or shot and killed by gun violence. And so it has been quite, eye-opening bit of time because it's not just with my school right now. It is an issue across the city, across the country, and so it has been. Yeah, it's been been tough. But this is why we do this work. So.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that we had chatted a little bit about the normalization of gun violence. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. I think, well, we were speaking about how you had that kind of that experience when you hear 10 kids, killed. I've had 10 kids personally who've been killed. And to hear that number, it's really, for us, it's, I mean, the responses I get from family, friends is always like, what? No, wow. For the kids, it's a whole different dynamic. It becomes almost just a casual conversation. And that's been years of this too, even before COVID. I think, that's something to keep in mind. The gun violence in a lot of these inner city communities has been an issue. And so it's important to understand that it becomes just another day-to-day conversation for the kids. And it's tough to see that.
For sure. I can't even imagine what that's like. I mean, you also made a really great point about how it seems like safety is like the end product of a lot of like intersectional kinds of problems. I'm curious to see what a lack of programming and like how virtual learning has affected the student involvement, especially since you work with kids who have learning disabilities.
Yeah, so specifically, what we do is we provide those kids who do have the IEP. A lot of my kids also have the emotional disturbance diagnosis, whether that be anxiety or PTSD. Providing them that support via virtual and how to do that has been a massive challenge. These kids, a lot of the times because we work with 9th through 12th grade, we're working with these kids coming from other schools. And so to be able to create that person-to-person relationship, to really get to know these kids has been a massive challenge. And so we are back in person now with some of the kids, and you can see it really has just been 180 in terms of being able to support them, being able to really, create and build those relationships.
And you talked about some of the things that were done to kind of address the uptick in violence. Can you tell us a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So we, after the most recent passing of one of our students, we had with other schools as well. And I believe there was a few organizations there. We work with, oh my God, I don't have the card, but we work with a Ceasefire is the program. And we work with Ceasefire out of our school, but they had a few representatives there. But we had a little bit of a rally to just let people know, especially at City Hall. We were asking for them to dedicate 100 million, I believe it was, of the budget to programming. And so, because I really think that's the big thing. I think that it's less of safety and more of providing opportunity. And so what we're doing specifically about that is we had as white teachers, we had a white allyship programming, and we met about a couple times a month, and just we read through a book, really discussed what it means to be a white teacher in this time in the city, and what we could do to provide the support not only to our students but our coworkers, our friends, our family. And so we've done that. And then the last thing is that this summer, which is, the summers are always very, very tough in the city. We have a youth enrichment program running for the kids. So what that is going to be is from 1 to 6, just providing them whatever it may be. We've partnered with a few programs like Driver's Ed. I believe there's Philadelphia. And so, just providing these kids something to do.
Awesome. Thank you so much for talking with us and being so candid about your experience. We really appreciate it.
I appreciate you having me.
I learned so much from that interview.
Yeah, it was interesting for him to talk about like safety as more of a result of addressing other problems more than it being just an isolated problem by itself.
And I think it's a good example of how investing in community resources can actually help reduce violence.
True, like school programs, mental health resources.
And there's so much overlap with the Safety Week and Feel report.
Yeah, with Adriaan's video as well as our text line.
What's missing in terms of response?
People did not say more police.
Exactly.
Safe communities have more resources and aren't over-policed. But by the way, Adriaan also subscribes to our gun violence SMS text newsletter on solutions, reporting, and community resources to gun violence. So if any of y'all are interested in getting that, it comes out once every 2 weeks. You can text survivors to 73224.
Awesome. Well, we're going to kick it back to Sergio and Demo from Reclaim to break down the budget even further.
You're tuned to WPPM LP Philadelphia 106.5 FM, PhillyCam Community Radio, and PhillyCam TV, also streaming live to Facebook. Thank you for tuning in to Reimagine, a partnership between Reclaim Philadelphia, Resolve Philly, and PhillyCam.
Hey everyone, my name is Sergio. I use El he him pronouns, and I'm one of your hosts and an organizer with Reclaim Philadelphia. I'm so excited that we're talking about the budget in this episode because I know that for many Philly residents, the city budget and the process and the decisions that lead to it can seem super wonky and out of reach for most of us. But movement leaders in Philly and in other cities have been trying to bridge the gap between community members and City Hall. And one of those leaders is Katya Perez, who is the mass liberation organizer with Reclaim. Katia, thank you so much for joining us in this discussion.
Thank you for inviting me. Just want to make sure, can you hear me?
Oh, I think you might be muted. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I'm not muted. I'm not sure why.
Okay, cool. Let me just disconnect this because this might be a Bluetooth situation. All right, can you hear me? Good?
Yes, I can hear you.
Cool. So Katya, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and what got you into organizing?
Yes. So I actually grew up in Elizabeth, New Jersey. That's North Jersey, right next to Newark. And I know that one of the first things that I saw that wasn't like a systemic issue, especially by the time I got to middle school, was just like how crappy our schools were. Elizabeth, New Jersey, Elizabeth High School does not have, or back then, I don't know about now, did not have like the best reputation. And I come from an immigrant household, daughter of Salvadoran immigrants. So it was always instilled in me, get an education, get a good job, you'll be able to like achieve the American dream, right? But I didn't see access to that. They didn't talk to us about college prep. They didn't talk to us about, just like even work training. A lot of the messaging that we got was like, don't get pregnant, don't join the gang, don't drop out. And I saw my mother struggle as a single mother. And so that's when I started asking questions, and this was the Bush years. So I'm just like looking at this and looking at the issue. I'm like, why is our school so underfunded? And just that lived experience too, growing up in an urban, just like Black and brown community, I also saw the relationship that my community had with the police, right? The police were stopping and frisking boys in middle school. We were like 12 and 11. And I remember just thinking, why are they doing this? Like, I don't see them doing this in the suburbs. So just being very just like paying attention to what was going on to my community. And I was paying attention because I wanted to get out. I did not want to struggle like my mother. You get me? I did not want to live through poverty. Poverty sucks. And I remember thinking, this sucks. I need to figure out a way to do better. But in all of that, I just saw just all the different systems of oppression that exist, that depending on where you were born, right? What your last name is, whether or not your parents are citizens, and all these different barriers that get in the way of just being able to stop being in survival mode. And that's what got me into wanting to understand the systems and organize around them.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Hopefully Sergio will come back, just a little technical difficulties, but yeah. I know we've also talked about this too on the side when it comes to the amount of structural, and when talking about this with Car earlier, the amount of generational trauma that comes out of this, right? And seeing why does one area have to have all this affluence while we're just getting breadcrumbs, right? And kind of just diving into it. And you really pointed out really well, and just the fact that budget impacts us in so many ways, and your personal stake in this fight. And do you feel like there's been changes within those structural, fights that we're advocating towards, or do you feel like there's still a long way to go?
There's a way to go. So like when I moved out here to PA, to Pennsylvania, and like I went to school to Temple and I saw North Philly, and North Philly just reminded me so much of home, just all of it, the community, but also seeing that intentional neglect of certain communities, right? Certain urban communities all over the country, just like seeing it again and seeing where Philly has chosen to invest, what neighborhoods to completely neglect for decades, right?
Yeah.
My first connection was with the Puerto Rican community in North Philly and like the neighborhood known as the Badlands, because I grew up around a lot of Caribbean people, so it's like where I navigate to. But like being told about the history just of like a Puerto Ricans in North Philly, and just when the Puerto Rican community was starting to like be able to get those union jobs in the factories that used to exist in North Philly, like in the 50s and 60s and 70s, it's when industrialization is slowing down. It's when there is no longer that middle class, like being able to buy a home eventually and achieve that status was becoming more and more bleak, less accessible, right? That American dream. So when it comes to this budget, right, it's not just about where the city is choosing to invest its money or not invest its money. It's also just making sure like that community has more input in what the city has chosen, because Philadelphia, even just look at what the Mayor Kenny has proposed for 2022, the fiscal year. Why is Mayor Kenny, our mayor, still proposing neoliberal like policies around budgets? Why tax cuts? Like how much more proof, right, do you need that trickle-down economics is not the thing? It's not what has communities thriving. It's what has a small percentage at the top, becoming richer at the expense of the rest of us, right? Why is Philadelphia still putting forth that same policy? So we're advocating, even though the budget is not like the sexiest thing to organize around, but money matters, right? It is our tax dollars. I live here. I know that I pay rent. I'm not a homeowner, but I know that the rent that I'm paying goes towards property taxes, that goes towards the city. I'm a consumer here. I know that the sales tax and everything goes towards the city. I live and work in Philadelphia. So those wage taxes, all those taxes go towards the city. I have a say, my community has a say in how the city is spending that money.
Yeah, and thank you for shouting out trickle down. Like the president even said, trickle down economics doesn't work. So why are we like doing this in our city? Have you been involved in the budget process before?
No, this is my first time organizing around a city budget. And this is a major city, right? It's been learning a lot. Like you mentioned before, right, for the technical issues, it's not attainable, this information. Like regular Philadelphians, if you're not, even just as organizers, there's so much we've had to learn during this process. And that's intentional, right? The system does benefit like those who are in power. I'm not saying they intentionally created the rules, but it is intentional, like just basically lack of information. Basically injustice is what happens like behind closed doors when no one's paying attention, right? So, and I'm saying that just because like just lack of access to how the information we're able to get about the budget or how it works or where different general funds go to, all of that is messy and difficult to understand, because it's not about democratizing that process so that we have a say, and that's what we're organizing towards, right? Making sure that we understand it better. Whatever we're learning, we're communicating that to community in an accessible way. And by accessible, I mean it better be something I can read really quickly and then keep going, and I can like then give that information to others. It shouldn't be a whole like series of op-eds that a bunch of people that I'm never going to meet write about, right? But as organizers, what we're trying to do, learn how this process works, communicate that back to the public, and have more and more people paying attention to that. One of the things that we did, so like we have, been at different events, like on May Day, we did have people out there talking to folks, convincing them, talking to them about testifying at the budget. We created a testimony guide, which made it a really easy, like this is how you testify. Because you can't even like sign up on like the city's website to testify. It's a whole like bureaucratic process. You have to like either email someone or call them and then give like legislative numbers to the bills and all of that. That's not info that's easily attained. So like we try to make just an easy how-to testimony guide for folks to encourage more folks to testify. Again, community education, we've been at public events, just like talking about the budget, just keeping it in people's minds and have like regular folks talking about it. And we've partnered up with different organizations. Like I know Juntos was mentioned before. They have their mutual aid day that they do, I think Mondays. Like they're giving out like basically slips on like, hey, this is what's happening with the budget, right? Just different political education opportunities that have been happening, but it's about making this more accessible to just regular folks.
Thank you. Yeah. I like I said, like this is like really wonky for a lot of people. So I'm sure it helps for viewers to know that like even the organizers are like, I don't know what's going on. I'm figuring it out as it goes.
Yeah.
I just wanted to like uplift that. So like people watching this know like the systems are designed this way and you don't have to be an expert to have your voice heard. Like even if your voice shakes, I think you should always use it.
Yeah.
So I do want to like mention, you know, last week was the 1 year anniversary of the death of George Floyd at the hands of police. This week is the 1 year anniversary of the police abuse in response to the uprising on 52nd Street here in West Philly, where I live, and on I-676. How do you see the budget as a way to prevent violence and abuse by the police?
I know one thing that I keep hearing being reverberated, like when people are talking about the budget, is that the budget is a moral document. The budget is showing you where the mayor, where city council are putting their priorities and are putting the money towards the programs that they want to push forward, right? So I know one of the things that we've been tackling with this budget has also been figuring out more and more ways that we can defund the police department, the Philadelphia Police Department, but making sure that that money goes back into communities, right? Goes back into program, make sure that the money goes to programs like for like housing. You know, you have the Philadelphia Eviction Prevention Project, which even though it passed in 2017, it was like temporarily halted during the pandemic, but we want that program fully funded. You know, the majority, the demographic most at risk and that tends to like get evicted are Black mothers, single mothers. That's messed up. You know, like the city needs to make sure that the budget goes to prioritizing the needs of the most vulnerable groups in Philadelphia, making sure that, for instance, like right to counsel is also fully funded. It passed, but it hasn't been funded yet. You know, when people are in housing court, usually the landlords always have their lawyer, but like just regular people don't have enough money to have a lawyer there when they're in housing court. So making sure that these types of programs that affect just regular people are funded and not more tax cuts, which is something that's been proposed by Mayor Kenny and some city council members. That's not what Philadelphians need. We don't need more tax cuts. That's not even going to benefit us, right? It's not tax cuts or sales tax. That's not what we're paying. It's not my wage tax, right? It's other types of tax cuts that benefit those who are wealthier, right? We need a budget that's a moral document that's reflective of the needs of us, of just regular Philadelphians, and also just the most vulnerable ones. We need to make sure that we're taking care of each other.
Thanks. And what are like, I know Reclaim's put out some demands. What are those demands for viewers who haven't seen them?
So definitely number one, like I said, like we are saying defund the police, or at least no more, increases to the Philadelphia Police Department. So for instance, the city is getting $1.4 billion in federal aid. And what we want at least is that to make sure that none of that money goes towards the Philadelphia Police Department. We also are like a third general umbrella demand is making sure that the rich are taxed, right? No more tax cuts. That basically just makes it so that the bill goes to the rest of us. Those tax cuts, like the money still has to come from somewhere. So we're asking for no more tax cuts to tax the rich. And the third one is fully funding, a 10-year commitment to fully funding community. So like I mentioned housing already, but making sure that there's $100 million investment towards programs that are community-based and violence prevention programs and gun violence prevention programs that are community-based. And we've had conversations with community organizations like Ceasefire, like Emir, Every Murder is Real, to make sure, you know, when it comes to like, hey, what is it that you need when it comes to these violence prevention programs that they've either already rolled out or have seen that need more funding? And the number one thing that's needed is like, they need long-term investment. If you want a reduction in crime, if you want a reduction in gun violence, you need long-term investment, because it takes actually investing in people, investing in youth, to make sure that those, crime rates do go down in the long term. So those are like the big three umbrella items that we're asking.
Yeah, and you touched on this a little bit, but Mayor Kenney had released his proposed budget, which includes tax cuts. Council members Dom and Parker have already introduced bills in council to cut taxes as well. Why are you pushing to tax the rich while the mayor and some members of council are pushing tax cuts?
We're pushing to tax the rich because it's what our community needs. When you have city officials who push for tax cuts for businesses or for wealthy folks, that money eventually needs to be made up, and that means it's going to be on the rest of us to make sure that that money, basically the city gets back its money. And we're pushing for tax cuts because it's what we need. Like I said before, it kind of a lot of times feels like the politics of either Mayor Kenney or some council members, like you mentioned, still lean towards that neoliberal side, which has been proven already that it's not working. We're trying to have these conversations with folks, with different council members, so that they understand hey, our community is asking for more than just these different tax cuts, right? We need long-term investment. We need a 10-year commitment. We need libraries and rec centers for our youth. A large number of people who are involved in gun crime in the city are youth, teenagers, high school age. That says a lot about basically where the city has chosen to invest in and who's been neglected.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's wild because, we're coming out of a pandemic, an economic recession, and I think it's really interesting that the mayor and the council members think this is the right time for tax cuts. And you did talk about this a little bit, but I wanted to see how you could dig in a little bit more. But something I know a lot of community members care about in West Philly, where I live, especially as we move into the summer, is rising gun and community violence. So how especially do you think the money should be used in the budget to combat violence in our neighborhoods?
So we have asked for $100 million investment in gun violence prevention programs that go to community organizations doing the work. And I was just going to say, like, another thing would be, though, that I haven't really mentioned here yet is that we've been talking to different council members, and that actually our partner organization, Amistad, has been pushing for a lot. And there was actually in like a last minute added budget hearing around mobile crisis units, right? So a lot of times, even before, let's say, an incident of violence happens, there are things that premeditate that incident of violence, right? Violence is really just the culmination of just like the after effect of like an explosion, right? When there's a kind of like a mental health issue going on, trauma, people dealing with trauma, not finding the right sources to heal. So if we can actually invest in like transformative measures, and what does that mean? That means actually preventing violence from actually happening in the first place. And the mental health system in Philadelphia is not enough. We need fully funded mobile crisis units. We need a Department of Behavioral Health where everyone is trauma informed, where they don't feel the need to have a cop with them when they're answering a crisis emergency at a household. So another thing that we've been talking to different city council members to, and then we've been encouraging community members to talk about, it has been making sure that the city does fully fund mobile crisis units, so that basically we don't have to get to the point where no one's doing anything until the explosions happen. In this case, it's gun violence, right? We do have to invest and make sure that we are investing in programs that stop that from happening, right? Making sure that we are, and it's not just like gun violence prevention programs, it's also like, it's not just funding like mental health, right? Or the mobile crisis unit. It's also making sure that the city is actually investing in schools and libraries and rec centers. And this is all going to take time. Not more cops though, because cops are just like basically a reactionary measure. They don't prevent violence from happening. So just to go back to like, hey, like how are we advocating for the city to invest in programs that deal with the long-term effects, right, of violence, and making sure that we do invest in more just transformative measures. Is also that making sure like mental health is fully funded, making sure that housing too, that there's full funding for housing programs and schools as well. So it's a lot, but basically the budget covers so much that affects so many different aspects of just our everyday lived lives that all do contribute, right? When it comes to the communities that are suffering from gun violence, all of this neglect, all of this divestment that the city has intentionally and city officials have intentionally done, this is what's happened now. But what we're doing with this, you know, with the organizing that we're doing around the budget is making sure that people understand that this is the basically the result of decades of neglect, but there's something we can do. Testify at those budget hearings, get involved with an organization whose values are in line with yours. Make sure you do start participating in your neighborhood groups, in different caucuses, to learn more about how people can get involved with Reclaim. Visit reclaimphiladelphia.org. Make sure you check us out on our Facebook and Instagram at Reclaim Philadelphia, and Twitter it's at Reclaim Phila. But get involved, right? Let's not make it so that last year is the year that we had an uprising and people protested and then things trickle down. No, we need to just make it part of life. Make sure that that community investment, making sure that how, you know, when we stay involved, making sure that we testify at every single budget hearing, right? Not everyone, but every year. Making sure that you are involved in your community and are kept up to date to what's going on.
Yeah, and thank you for like naming. So much of the work is so interconnected. You had talked about right to counsel, the Philly Eviction Prevention Project, which has been doing so much work and needs funding. And there were studies that showed that eviction prevention is basically healthcare, because people who have shelter are not contracting COVID as regularly. They're more able to self-isolate and protect themselves. So there's like all of these different things, and that is gun violence too. Like I know I've talked to folks who have been impacted by the carceral system, who say that the thing that they most would need is like resources like housing that would have prevented them from getting involved in violence in the first place. So I really appreciate all the work that movement leaders across the city and Reclaim and other organizations have been doing, and Coalition. I know y'all have been doing. You got folks to testify. What are you asking folks to do now that the public testimony is done, and how can folks get involved?
So the public testimony is done, but the city budget isn't finalized until June 30th. So people can still, you can call. Today we have today's a call-in day. So if you visit our Reclaim, our social media, there's instructions on like which council members you can call. There's a little sample script that you can use too. But making sure that you participate in call-in days. Call your district council member too. Let them know how you feel about the budget, what changes you want to see, because like a lot of our council members aren't used to constituents calling them regularly. Make it a habit, you know? And we do Reclaim. We are having a direct action next week on Wednesday at City Hall at 5 p.m. So stay tuned to our, again, social media pages, like I said, on Facebook and Instagram at Reclaim Philadelphia, to keep up to date about next Wednesday's action as well. Today is a call-in day. Call city council, call your council member, and do become involved. Do become involved. Find your organizational home. What organization do you feel like you want to get more involved in, that you can keep up to date with, that you know, when it comes to the budget or anything else that's going on in the city, ways that facilitate you getting involved. So I'm here with Reclaim. I'm pitching, hey, get involved with us. But just make sure you find an organizational home that you can become involved in, so that there are organizers out here. We're doing this work to make it easier for you to be involved, because I know how hard it is. I grew up with a single mother. I could never imagine her having time to like create a committee, right, of like concerned parents or something. She did not have the time. She had 2 jobs and 3 kids, right? But what we're doing as organizers, making sure that this information is accessible to you in all of the myriad of ways that's possible. Today's a call-in day. Hey, take like 5 minutes from your lunch and do that. If you have time next week, after work at 5 p.m. at City Hall. Come over, listen to the demands that we have about the budget and the different community members that are invested in this. But make sure you find an organization at home.
Awesome. Thank you so much for this, Katya, and thank you for your work and the work of all, like, so many movement leaders that are doing across the city and in other cities. Like, many cities are looking towards the budget. They're paying attention to local politics. And we know that budgets, as you said, are moral documents, and it's not just on behalf of the mayor and city council. They're acting on behalf of us, taxpayers. This is our money, so we should have a voice and a say in how we do this. And we know that these documents only benefit and reflect the community when the community is centered and involved. So thank you so much, Katya. Next, as we do every episode, we will end with a group reflection with all of the Reimagined hosts. We'll see all together.
All right, and we're Hey y'all. Yeah, I definitely wanted to just thank everybody again for another great episode. I feel like there's always bits and pieces that really stick with me, especially the conversations on Resolve's side when it comes to, hey, folks don't want cops. Hey, we can see the ways in which like stigmas pertain to like not only physical trauma, but also mental health and well-being. Because I think most of the time, because of how much rapid information, how much rapid response we've been in since like the past year, essentially, and going on the 1 year anniversary of, you know, the uprisings and what happened on I-676 and also 52nd Street, there has been, you know, the need for, you know, continuous dialogue on this and how it's reflected in these other spaces, especially concerning like the budget too, because of the fact that, you know, so many communities are disenfranchised, but we can see the ways in which there are specific pillars that like block communities from actually like thriving, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I think that what really struck me with the segment that you guys had was just like thinking about how residents and community members can get involved in the budget. I think that like sometimes it's like organizing and stuff like the budget is just very scary and like unattainable in terms of like getting involved and giving people just very clear and tangible ways in which they can actually like voice their needs, especially around safety, is just such a valuable thing. I feel like folks just don't know that they can get out there, they can get involved in this kind of way.
Yeah, Katia put it very well that the budget is not sexy. It's not accessible. It's not super fun to, I mean, even sitting down to even look at the budget, which is the first time I had ever even looked at the PDF document that's available by the city. And it's, you know, it's so dense. And so how are we supposed to get people involved if information just isn't accessible, if people don't have time? So I really appreciated that Katia spoke on that.
Yeah, I think that you speak to something like a lot of the reason that people don't get involved is one, because they don't know about it. They don't know how to have the tools, but there is a lot of self-talk that we all have about like, oh, does my voice actually matter? Like, do I know enough about the budget? Like, am I smart enough? I know like myself, I'm a high school dropout. So like, I always like, I'm like I have this like imposter syndrome when I'm in these spaces. But, you know, a lot of folks don't really know what's going on. And if we don't, like, if we just expect other people to make those decisions for us, they're not going to be in line with what we want. So what I really hope is that more people like think that you don't have to be like the smartest person to know every single thing, not have like done some research. Because a lot of times when you think about people in power, they ain't always the smartest. You know, like it's not like the Nobel Prize winners who are the mayors. And you know, the scientists that are like the presidents of day in and day out. So like you can have your voice heard and be part of this process. And I'm glad that we're getting together and trying to make it easier for folks to actually engage.
Yeah, definitely. And even speaking on like the communications aspect, there's been a lot of really, I would say like really healthy challenges when it comes to presenting this information because of the fact, Lily, you mentioned it's so dense, it's so heavy. Like, what are the right things to say? What are the things that like, you know, have to really hit the mark for folks? And most of it comes from like that personal story. I know from like the first episode too, when talking about the judicial races, I didn't have a lot of background with it. And I was like, okay, I want to go into this, you know, gaining something, but also asking the right questions too, and not being afraid to speak up, even if I don't know everything off the top of my head. And I think that's part of the work that we are trying to do, not only as like, you know, community members, but even like within organizing, like we're trying to dismantle systems that create this sort of like cold and like harsh sort of barrier around people, and also creating systems of support and creating like those honest and open, you know, spaces for dialogue and continuous dialogue too. Even if it's like a simple tweet, like that goes into like one specific quote that's like, oh, that quote or that specific story like aligns with me and that like sticks with me. So that way, like when I go back into, you know, researching more in depth, I can remember like those specific like parts of, you know, people's stories and what people really care about and what they're really passionate about.
Yeah, for sure. It's like kind of, it's like connecting people's lived experiences and then putting that into the context of like, how can you make that life better for yourself and the community around you? Obviously easier said than done, but it's like you said, Sergio, it's like really not about education. It's really about valuing the experience that you've had and that you've lived. And that in and of itself is valid enough.
Yeah, and we cannot be searching for perfectionism. Like if you don't have the answer, like get to like that's the power of movements together. Like if I don't have the answer, my neighbor might have it, or my family member, or that person down the street that I see at the grocery store. If we all get together, we all together collectively can come up with the decisions that we need for our community. I was wondering, like with y'all in the text line, was there anything that surprised you that you went with your text that you got from responses from folks?
Honestly, I don't think we were very surprised. I think that it was just very clear that like the report and what people's responses were just so in tandem that they were just like very reflective of each other. But Lily and Gabs, what do you guys think?
No, I definitely agree that there was some major overlap and something that definitely caught my attention, not only in the report, but even in just some of the comments concerning like police involvement in a lot of the issues that go on in our city. It's just like, what exactly are cops doing to prevent crime, right? Like, I feel like we had a whole conversation about this, and even just like thinking back on the incident on I-676, it's like, were they really preventing crime that day? Like, how do we, like, is that their job? Like, because it doesn't really seem that way from the outside, you know?
Yeah.
And also potholes. I feel like we talk a lot about potholes.
Oh yeah.
Like, where is the money going? Because I popped a tire on a pothole. Like, what are we gonna do about that? You know?
Right.
You just named my committee person struggle. Every time I talk to the people in my division, they want to talk about potholes, and I'm like, yes, and like we need more money for infrastructure and for all these other things. Like, I think it really helps for folks to think about what is like the ideal community that they think of when they think of a safe community, or like a community that they think has everything. It's rarely like I see the police on every corner. You know, it's like, no, it's fully funded schools. It's these lush parks. It's these libraries and recreation centers that have staff and are open so that like folks can take advantage of them. And I think that that's reflective of what y'all saw in the responses. And I also want to say that this is the power of people power movements, but like changing the narrative, because like, you know, this has taken a long time for folks to like get in line with this kind of thing. And it, you know, it's part of like, you know, as our title, we're reimagining how to do things a little bit differently.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure.
Yeah, I think that's a really good closeout, actually. So I just want to say thank you so much. Shout out to Philly Cam. Shout out to Laura and Sergio as well for helping out. Like it was mentioned before, you could follow Reclaim Philadelphia on all major platforms, at Reclaim Phila on Twitter, and then Reclaim Philadelphia on Instagram and Facebook. And I'll kick it over to Resolve.
Yeah, all of our handles on social is equalinfo215, and you can always text us at equalinfo to 73224.